If you ever find yourself in this corner of the jewellery quarter in Birmingham, it doesn't take long before you stumble across something that feels completely out of place. Surrounded by the constant noise of a modern city sits Warstone Lane Cemetery, a place that looks as though it belongs in a different part of Birmingham entirely. At first, it appears to be just another Victorian graveyard. The kind of place that's filled with weathered headstones, winding paths and names that have long since faded from public memory. But the more time you spend here, the stranger the story becomes, because this cemetery was born out of a crisis. Built on a land that had already been heavily altered by industry and home to one of the most unusual catacomb systems in Britain. It's also connected to stories that stretch from the Industrial Revolution to the Second World War, and even as far away as Australia. To understand why the cemetery exists at all, you have to go back to Birmingham during the first half of the 19th century. The city was expanding at a difficult rate, drawing people in from across the country as factories and businesses grew larger and more successful. Now, while that growth brought wealth and opportunity, it also created problems that nobody had really planned for. And one of those problems was death. Birmingham's churchyards had been designed for a much smaller population, and as the city continued to grow, they began filling up at an alarming pace. Graves, well, they were packed tightly together. Burial space became increasingly scarce, and concerns started to grow about both sanitation and the health of the public. By the 1940s, some churchyards were effectively full, and there was a growing belief that a new solution was needed. That solution arrived in 1848 with the opening of Warstone Lane Cemetery. It was established by the Church of England Cemetery Company, and was intended to provide a large new burial ground for Birmingham's Anglican population. Yet interestingly, it wasn't alone. Right next door stood Key Hill Cemetery, which had opened a little earlier and primarily served Birmingham's nonconformist communities, people who belonged to religious groups outside of the Church of England. What you ended up with was a fascinating reflection of Victorian society, where two neighbouring cemeteries quietly represented two different religious traditions. Even in death, the divisions that existed in life were still visible on the landscape. One of the reasons Warstone Lane Cemetery looks so distinctive today is because of the land that it was built on. Before becoming a cemetery, parts of the site had been worked as sandpits and quarries, leaving behind steep banks and uneven ground that could easily have been seen as a problem. Rather than trying to completely reshape the landscape, the cemetery's designers chose to work with it, and that decision led to the feature that makes Warstone Lane famous today. Built directly into the hillside were a series of catacombs, creating a burial system unlike anything that most people would expect to find in the middle of Brum. Instead of simply placing graves across the open ground, the cemetery could use the slopes themselves to hold additional burials, making efficient use of the space available. And standing in front of the catacombs today, it's easy to see why they capture people's attention. They feel more like something you'd expect to find in a major European city than in the heart of the Midlands. Long rows of arched openings disappear into the hillside, creating a structure that feels both impressive and slightly unsettling. Yet despite how striking and how look, the catacombs were originally a practical solution to a practical problem. Brum needed more burial space, and the terrain offered an opportunity to create it. The result was one of the most unusual cemetery layouts in Britain, and more than 170 years later, it remains the feature that most visitors remember. Yet what many people don't realise is that the catacombs also became the centre of a controversy. During the Victorian period, there was widespread concern about something known as miasma, the belief that diseases could spread through unpleasant vapours and bad smells. Today we know many of those theories were incorrect, but at the time they were taken very seriously. Complaints began to emerge about odours coming from the catacombs, and concerns were raised about what might happen when large numbers of bodies were interred within enclosed spaces. As a result, regulations were introduced, which meant that coffins placed in vaults and catacombs to be properly sealed, often using lead or pitch. It's one of those details that sounds bizarre from a modern perspective, but it reveals just how much Victorian attitudes towards death, disease and public health differed from our own. The people buried within the catacombs also tell us something about Birmingham society at the time. Burial within the catacombs generally cost more than a standard grave, which meant the spaces were often occupied by wealthier individuals and established local families. Rather than a single coffin, some vaults were designed to hold multiple family members, creating a private burial chamber that could be used across generations. Even today, some of the original metal coffins remain inside, Many of the names have faded from public memory, but the catacombs still provide a glimpse into a period when status and social standing could influence not only how you lived, but also where you were laid to rest. One of the more unexpected stories connected with the catacombs concerns the University of Brum. Historical accounts suggest that two of the vaults eventually came under university ownership, and that bodies from those spaces were used in teaching. It's a detail that feels almost impossible to imagine today, particularly when standing among the quiet pathways of the cemetery. Yet it reflects a period when medicine, education and burial practices often intersected in ways that now seem deeply strange. It also adds another layer to the story of the catacombs, because these spaces were not simply places of remembrance. At different points in their history, they served many different purposes that the original designers may not have anticipated. Perhaps the most remarkable change in their use came during the Second World War. During the Birmingham Blitz, when German bombing raids threatened the city, the catacombs took on an entirely different role. Instead of housing the dead that provided shelter for the living, local residents used the underground spaces as air raid shelters, seeking protection from bombs falling from overhead. Now what a mad image if you imagine that just for a second. A structure built in the 19th century to house coffins became a refuge for families trying to survive one of the most dangerous periods in Birmingham's history. For many people, the catacombs were no longer associated with death at all. They were a place of safety. Another feature that's largely disappeared from public view was the cemetery chapel. Today, visitors often focus on the catacombs themselves, but originally the site included a substantial Gothic chapel that stood as the centrepiece of the cemetery. But more fascinating than that was the engineering hidden beneath it, because historical records describe a hydraulic lift that allowed coffins to be lowered directly from the chapel into the catacombs below. Victorian society often combined practicality with enthusiasm for engineering, and this was a perfect example. Rather than carrying coffins down through the various levels by hand, the hydraulic system provided a controlled and efficient way to move them underground. Unfortunately, the chapel suffered damage during the Second World War and was eventually demolished, leaving behind only fragments of a structure that once dominated the cemetery. Among the thousands of people buried here are several individuals whose stories extend far beyond Birmingham itself. Today, nature's reclaimed parts of the cemetery, and it's definitely used in a different way to the way that it was intended. Many of the monuments show the wear of nearly 2 centuries of weather and neglect. Yet that almost adds to the character. The cemetery has witnessed Birmingham's explosive industrial growth, the fears of Victorian disease, the destruction of wartime bombing, and the transformation of the city around it. And for most visitors, the catacombs are what first catch the eye. But the longer you spend here, the more you realise they're only one chapter in a much larger story. Because hidden behind the workshops and the streets of the jewellery quarter is a place that quietly preserves some of Birmingham's most unusual history. And once you know what happened here, it becomes impossible to see it as just another old graveyard.